explain the first the Underground Railroad significance. This is the wheel, and if a escaping slave would see a quilt like this hung on the porch to air out, this would be a symbol that you got to find a wagon or cart to make the escape. This quilt's from about 1880. This quilt is from about 1930 because it has the feed sacks. Anything that has feed sacks would be about 1930, 1940, 1950. This was made by a white woman. This was made by a black woman, African American woman. Or should I say, this was made for a white woman. And that's why I put these two together, because I imagine, although they're decades apart, that, and this would be considered a very fine quilt. You see, it's 1880, so it's been preserved very well. So this was probably a wedding present and preserved through many generations and not used much, because there's actually hardly any marks or stains in it. And if you have a cover on a bed, it's all, the first day it gets dirty. So I have a feeling this was in a closet or box for forever. Also, some people theorize this is a compass. So if you're seeing this compass, that means to an escaping slave you're on the right path. But I imagine that, let's say this was being made at a white woman's house, and this is from the South, Louisiana or Texas. By the quality of this quilt, it was a wealthy woman. So she would have had help in the house. By looks of it, probably a lot of help. So you have maybe around 12 stitches per inch, which is a very tight sewing pattern, very tight stitch. So it would take a long time to make this. And probably, although many women would have made these by themselves, I have a feeling she had some help. So I imagine the ladies who helped her were African American. Not imagine, they certainly were. And at night when it was dark, after maybe 10 or 12 hours in the house, they went home because they had to feed their kids, they had to take care of their kids, they had to make sure that their kids were warm because it was cold down there too in the wintertime. And she made this quilt. But as you can see, this quilt's beautiful. But it's kind of static. I love it, but it doesn't move, doesn't go anyplace. This quilt, made rapidly, because the stitch count here is much, maybe 4 or 5 an inch. The lady was in a hurry because she had to go back to work early the next morning. And even on Sundays sometimes, if there was a big dinner, she had to be there working 7 days a week. So she had to hurry it up. But look how what she did when she was hurrying it up. This to me is just amazingly beautiful quilt with the way the Dixie Hummingbirds sang gospel with soul. This lady quilted this quilt with soul. This is a soulful, vibrant, moving, everything about it is alive. There's nothing thinking. And here's the wheel, which is one of the symbols of Ozella Williams, that her family carried on this narrative, that this would have been, you see this hanging on the porch? Especially if you saw this hanging on a porch, you probably thought this is, you knew for sure this is an African American home. You could get help there. There's no doubt about that. They're going to help you. This, you're not going to go there for help. You're going to get turned in.
Get turned in.
Well, getting turned in is, Okay. This quilt here is, of course, this quilt's not that old. This is machine made. All these other ones we've seen are all handmade. This is probably from 1950, 1960. African American woman made this because the dealer who I bought this from bought it from an African American woman in the South. Thank you. And these are a ship. These are a fleet of ships. And if you accept this Ozella Williams family's narrative that the ship was a conveyance towards freedom, this quilt here is going to freedom. And just look at how many ships are in this fleet. This is a fleet of ships going to freedom. And I've had this hanging up for a long time. I look at it often. And there's a great French painter named Monet. He's an impressionist painter. And he painted a haystack 100 times. Well, actually, this lady is a Monet too, because she has painted in fabric, in stitches, this not 100 times, but many times. And every time the light, the idea of Monet painting the haystack many times was a different light, different angles, different whatever. So every painting is different, the colors are different. We have a Monet right here. And I just love the movement and the motion, and you know you're at sea when you're looking at this quilt. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Suzette, what does the basket mean? I forget.
I think you have one of, like, you fill it, you fill your basket.
Yeah, you know, one of the ways that Harriet Tubman was so successful, how many slaves did she help from Eastern Maryland, Delaware? 700, I think it was. I think in her lifetime she helped 7,000, but that was during the Civil War. In fact, she tells a story that she would often act, as she was escaping many, many miles, she would act as if she was just coming from market. And she would have chicken, live chickens back then. They didn't have refrigeration. So and she was well known in that area because she had been back and forth 20 times. And her family was there. All the white people knew who she was, but she was always in disguise. So if she saw somebody who she thought knew her or might recognize her, she had a string that she would start pulling the chicken would start going wild and start screaming, flapping its wings, you know, trying to get loose, and everybody's looking at this chicken, and nobody knows it's Harriet Tubman, and she just keeps on going to Philadelphia with her wagon, which is, you know, in the bottom, in the trap door are some slaves. So, where's that basket? Yeah. She carried a basket often as a way of escaping. I don't know if I have any basket quilts here or not, I forget. This is just a beautiful X quilt here. This is from about the same era as that, about 1950s, also machine made. Oh no, that's the, oh yeah, this is the back of the ship quilt. I forgot. Just amazing. Wow. And in these farmhouses, there might have been 4 or 5 kids sleeping in the same bed. So there were 4 or 5 kids being kept warm by this. And they knew they were loved when they had a mother like this making a quilt like this.
Teach them.
And here is actually this is a much more traditional material that you would have found on many of the farms because there's a lot of denim in here. I actually left the denim quilts at home. Those would have been the most prevalent because people were wearing farm clothes, not blue jeans, but the coveralls made out of denim.
Right.
And the women, when they were worn out, would sew the denim into the quilt. In fact, the Gee's Bend, one of the most moving stories of the Gee's Bend quilts, I know many of you have seen the documentary about 10 or 12 years ago. And I actually met the great-granddaughter of the woman who quilted that. Actually, it's her daughter telling the story, so I met her daughter. And the granddaughter, by the time I met her, was very old also. In the 1930s, her husband died, the great-grandmother. And she took when he died, her daughter and his wife took every piece of material of clothing that he had. He didn't have these suits. He had blue jeans, dungarees, these coveralls made out of, that was it. And she made a quilt out of this and used every scrap of clothing he had to make one quilt. That's all he had. And she said that when she would go to sleep at night, she would wrap herself in that quilt and cry herself to sleep because her man was still hugging her.
Wow.
And when you hear that story, it's like, and when you look at that quilt in the exhibition, because it was in Philadelphia, I saw it in Auburn, I saw it in Boston, you actually see patches on top of patches on top of patches. So this is the kind of material that would have been very prevalent in homes, this denim material.
Can you turn it around so we can?
Yeah, sure. And here again is this X, but it's not really an X, it's a chi, which is the first letter in Greek of Christ.